Vulnerability. The state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. I've recently had discussions with a number of female friends about male vulnerability and their desire for their partners to be more vulnerable, emotionally expressive, to cry and share their fears, hopes, and dreams. They said things like, "Men can be vulnerable and express what they are feeling and still be loved. Vulnerability is not weakness." Correlating vulnerability and weakness as one and the same shows that men don't understand what vulnerability is. Vulnerability is necessary for intimacy and connection. I'm inclined to agree with this. It does take courage and strength to put oneself out there and be vulnerable, to risk rejection, humiliation, or suffer an emotional wounding. However, by the very nature of the definition of vulnerability being a risk of enduring attack or harm, vulnerability is expressing some sort of weakness, not necessarily weakness in the common sense of the word, but weakness, as in exposing the weakest points of one's armor to show where you're most easily wounded. Over and over again, the messaging I see coming from feminine media and spaces and self-development circles is that women want more vulnerability from their partners and that men just need to step up and be more vulnerable. I think we can all agree that vulnerability is required at some level for intimacy, but what exactly are we talking about here? What do women mean by vulnerability? For many men, vulnerability is just another female abstraction that means very little and isn't well described. Something women say they want, but men often feel that women rarely communicate what exactly they want in clear ways that men can understand. What precisely do women want when they want men to be more vulnerable? Men know what vulnerability is as a feeling, but it's somewhat vague. Where are the boundaries? How much is too much? In addition to these questions, the common male experience is that male vulnerability has consequences. Online, many men say they have been shamed or hurt for being vulnerable. Male vulnerability seems too much for many women, and men know this. It just takes reading the comments on any video or article discussing vulnerability to see that men are in a bind. Story after story of men being vulnerable with their partner and being shamed or having it used against them in a later disagreement, or worse, their woman losing attraction and leaving them. On one hand, they're being told to be more vulnerable, to express their emotions, fears, traumas, and experiences, but on the other hand, they are told to man up, be strong, don't be a pussy. Or their vulnerability or emotions are brushed off, and they are treated as if they're lesser for even trying or wanting to be vulnerable in the first place. So, what is happening? Why the mixed signaling? Why do women say one thing but in practice do the opposite? Well, I think there is quite a few things happening here. I'm going to try to break this down and see if we can make sense of this. First, there is large variation within humans and their wants, desires, and comfort levels with vulnerability. There are many women that are uncomfortable with or turned off by male vulnerability. Some women are attached to an image of the masculine that does not include male vulnerability. One could say that those are not the women that men should be looking for, but the majority of men do not have a lot of options and are limited by what's common in their culture. From another perspective, perhaps many men do not have the emotional intelligence to be able to be vulnerable in healthy ways, and negative feminine reactions to this is due to ungrounded male vulnerability. For many men, society has never valued their emotions and vulnerability, so it can be difficult to understand how to be vulnerable in a healthy way. When they do, it can be in a way that makes their partner feel unsafe. Either way, it is dishonest to tell men that they can be vulnerable and freely express their emotions, fears, and traumas without consequences, when the male experience is that often there are humiliating and even relationship-destroying consequences. Still, let us see if we can find a useful way to look at this. Is there a way to map the female response to male vulnerability and the health of male expression? I think of the female response to male vulnerability as an alignment scale. How aligned is her mind, body, and emotions with desiring and holding space for her partner's vulnerability? This is on a spectrum, and every woman will differ on where she is on these three categories. Mind. whether she wants male vulnerability in her relationship or not. Some women deeply want it, and others simply do not desire it. Also, does she have an image of masculinity that includes vulnerability, or will she think less of him for it? Body. Is she turned off by vulnerability? Some women are turned off by male vulnerability, and it gives them a sense of disgust. For others, it makes them feel closer to their partner and they're aroused by vulnerability. Emotions. Does she have the emotional maturity or emotional fortitude to understand, empathize, and hold space for male vulnerability? Does it make her feel unsafe or closer to her partner? If these are misaligned, this is where men see mixed signals. Her mind may want male vulnerability, but her body is turned off by it. Or her mind and body want it, but her emotions make her feel unsafe or that her man can't be relied on. If all three of these are aligned, men get honest signals and will know if they can trust their partner to be available for them in that way. For men, I imagine healthy vulnerability has to do with how grounded he is in his emotions and thoughts about this vulnerability. Groundedness comes from having built emotional intelligence and fortitude and being okay with and secure in his vulnerabilities. I'm going to call this the groundedness scale. Mind. How grounded he is in his thoughts about this particular vulnerability and sharing it. Is he comfortable sharing, or does he feel pressured or insecure about sharing? Emotions. How strong are his emotions around this particular vulnerability? The stronger the emotion, the less likely he is to be grounded. How grounded the male is will interact with how aligned the female is. The less grounded the male is, the more likely she will not feel safe or closer to her partner. Lastly, let us consider the heaviness of vulnerability as a scale from light to heavy vulnerability. I think of this scale as low perceived risk to high perceived risk of rejection. Light vulnerability is on the lower risk end and is sharing anything that could, but is unlikely to, lead to rejection or reduced connection. Heavy vulnerability is on the high perceived risk end of the scale and is sharing shame, deep fears, insecurities, traumas, mistakes, hurts, and dark desires. The heaviness of the vulnerability impacts the male's groundedness and affects how strong his emotions are. His groundedness works in the opposite direction to lighten the vulnerability. Also, the more aligned a woman is with desiring and being present for vulnerability, the lighter it will feel, and the opposite is true. All three of these scales combined interact to determine how she will likely respond to male vulnerability. Now, one could make the argument that for vulnerability to be acceptable, it can't really be heavy vulnerability because of the groundedness or healing and acceptance required to lighten it, unless with a woman who is highly aligned and emotionally intelligent and has done a lot of work on herself. Either way, I will argue that heavy vulnerability isn't required for deeply intimate relationships. I personally would suggest to men that until your partner has earned your trust and has proven that they are safe, and you've done enough work on yourself to stay grounded, do not share heavy vulnerabilities. The risks outweigh the benefits. As a man, strength is valuable, and there's nothing wrong in simply being strong, stoic, and masculine. You can achieve strong intimacy with very little vulnerability. Be vulnerable with your male friends, if you must. They are often far more understanding and helpful, and sharing with them is less likely to stain your relationships. Like women with their bodies, you do not owe your vulnerability to anyone. Wait until you are ready to open up. Take your time. Communicate with your partner. If deep vulnerability is something you both want, let her know that you'll open up when you're ready and that she has to earn your trust and prove her alignment first. And for women, if you really want your partner to be vulnerable, work on yourselves. Find out how aligned you are and if you are prepared for male vulnerability. Be honest with yourself and what you really want and where you stand. Communicate honestly with your partner, even if that means telling them you're not ready for their vulnerability yet. Trust me, I've known women who have actually done this, and any man would much rather hear that you're not available for that vulnerability than be rejected or hurt over it. Ultimately, though, for those of us on a path of spirituality, authenticity, and personal development, The goal is to achieve a relationship where we hold nothing back and are deeply vulnerable with each other, with strong emotional bonds. This is possible if you find a partner who is willing to grow with you through good communication, trust building, and healing your wounds. You do not have to throw it out entirely just because it's dangerous or scary. This ideal relationship is possible, and I hope you all find a way to achieve it. Please tell me your thoughts in the comments.